Aloha! Welcome to our Hawaii Association of Language Teachers 2020 Virtual Summer Summit. This is an introduction video to Comprehension-based Communicative Language Teaching, CCLT, which is our Summer Summit's highlight or theme. This video will be especially helpful if you are new to comprehension-based instruction and want a little more background. First, the planning committee would like to introduce ourselves one at a time. I'm Nan Ta, and I teach Chinese at Iolani School.
I'm Will Smith. I'm a Japanese teacher at Waipahu High School. Also, Joyce Brumble, a Spanish teacher at Waipahu High School, was not able to join us today.
All right, aloha, I'm Gina Conche, and I'm a Spanish teacher at Maui High School. Oh, Reed, you're muted.
Thank you. Hello, I'm Reed Riggs. I'm a Chinese instructor at Brigham Young University, Hawaii.
Hi, I'm Evelyn Coffey, and I'm a French lecturer at the University of Hawaii.
In this presentation, we will cover these 5 main areas: CCLT, basic descriptions, personal teaching stories, history of practices, CCLT popularity today, and related research. Here are some basic descriptions of CCLT. CCLT is built on the idea that understanding language that we hear and read is a fundamental ingredient in a learner's experience to achieving proficiency in the target language. When we say proficiency, we mean the ability to use a language in a variety of contexts. And under the CCLT umbrella, we find many teachers enacting teaching in different ways. CCLT can refer to a wide variety of teaching methods and activities such as TPRS, and activities such as one-word image, there's content-based instruction, immersion, natural approach, movie talk, input-based task, and TPR. We will describe some of these in more detail in this presentation. CCLT is not the only term that people use to refer to teaching that mainly focuses on learners comprehending input. CCLT is the term used by teachers in the ACTFL special interest group. Researchers will more often use the term comprehension-based instruction, or CBI, while a common term still in use by many teachers is teaching through comprehensible input. Sometimes that's just called CI teaching or TCI. Now we will discuss 5 basic descriptions of CCLT: learning goals, communication, grammar, stress, and community.
So our first learning goal when we use these methods, the CCLT, is that we are focusing on proficiency, as Nan said earlier, as our main purpose for the ways we teach. And proficiency means you're working towards having your students being able to communicate in the language rather than just analyze or talk about the language.
So the second goal is communication, which we have a definition here of communication. The definition of communication is really, I feel, very important for understanding what communicative language teaching is. Communication stands for the interpretation, expression, and sometimes negotiation of meaning. So when we think of interpretation, that's referring to the language that's coming in. So when we're interpreting, we're listening, and we are possibly reading or even watching someone who's signing with sign language or gesturing. Expression of meaning is the language that goes out. So that's when we're speaking or signing or even gesturing, and also writing. And then negotiation of meaning just refers to when there's a breakdown in communication. So if you are if you're not understanding what someone is saying, that's when you say, wait a minute, what did you say? Or you clarify and say, did you mean to say this? Is this what you're trying to communicate? And that's what negotiation of meaning is. Communication is in a given context and for a given purpose. So communication is very different from practicing language. And I think that's where this term is super important. You need to remember that this is not about practicing language, it's actually about engaging in a communicative event with another person. And for the teaching will focus on the interpretation of meaning. So constantly as a teacher, we are, with communicative language teaching, we're constantly trying to make sure that students are understanding the messages that we're giving to them. So using communication, or this definition of communication as a way to analyze what you're doing in the classroom is a really good start.
Grammar. Grammar is something that we recognize is a core concern to most language teachers, teaching materials, teaching training. It's something that teachers often ask about. What about grammar? How do I teach grammar? How do students learn grammar? How do we assess grammar? So what you'll often see as a response from teachers who teach with a focus on comprehension, the CCLT teachers, is that we talk about grammar coming from the input, coming from when students read a sentence, that they're seeing how the grammar is used in that sentence. And when they hear people speak, the grammar is there in the speech, it's in what they're hearing. And so as teachers, some CCLT teachers will say, keep it completely implicit, meaning learners don't have to know about grammar structures and things. While others will say we can sort of pop up grammar. We can, during a conversation or during reading, we'll say, notice this word in this context means this here. We know that teachers will often like to list, here are some other contexts, here's in the dictionary, here's 6 other meanings this might have. Typically in comprehension-based instruction, we're letting learners see the one meaning in the one context, and then maybe the next day or the next couple of minutes later, they'll see that word in a different sentence or a different conversation. And it's over time that they'll build up their sense of the grammar. And teachers have the option to point it out, to say, notice this grammar here, here's what it means. But typically we avoid long lists of all the possible meanings that it could have.
Okay. Teachers doing comprehension-based instruction will often emphasize that learners should feel minimal stress about comprehending and producing language when they talk about things of interest. Stress can act as a distraction to comprehension, and overwhelming our students is something we want to avoid. Teachers will often invite learners to help decide what the class will talk about to ensure that everyone is having fun and enjoying communicating with the language. So in short, we keep anxiety at a minimum.
One of the huge benefits of a CLT classroom, I feel, is the community that grows as the school year goes along. Just like Nan mentioned, without the stress in the classroom, there's not anything holding students back from helping each other out. Everybody understands that they're all at their levels, and whether or not that's the same as the person sitting on either side of them, that's okay. Everybody's where they are at. And that release of stress of trying to be at a certain point, or I'm not with them, helps the students kind of come together and feel free to help each other, but also ask for help when they need it. And just that openness creates a community in the classroom that I personally haven't seen in other styles. And CLT, I think, this is really one of the huge benefits to this kind of teaching.
All right, so thanks everybody for sharing our goals. So now I'm going to tell you a little story about my teaching adventure. So I started teaching Spanish on the island of Maui in 2006. I came in first to Kinkekalike High School, where I stayed for 6 years. And then I moved to Maui High School, where I've been ever since. And kind of in the middle of all that, I was also teaching part-time for Kihei Charter. So I'm going to just kind of tell you about my experience from the beginning. So when I first started teaching up as a brand new teacher, I was super excited, always had a smile on my face, and I just thought I was going to conquer the world and that everyone was going to learn Spanish. And I couldn't wait to get started. I didn't actually have a formal education as a teacher. I had other education, but not as a teacher. And so I went in thinking, okay, well, I know how to do this because I learned a language. And so I, had the textbook there, and I said, okay, well, let me follow this textbook, and I'm going to teach my students how to conjugate verbs, and I'm going to teach them all of these different verbs so that they have language that they can use and how to put sentences together. And I was always up there at the front smiling. And when it came time for my students, they were not as excited about it as I was. But that's okay, because they were students, and so you kind of expect that maybe they're not going to be so excited. But after a couple years of teaching, I found that even though I had been, up there at the board teaching them all of this language and thinking, oh yes, you've got it. And they would even pass the test sometimes, most of the time, but sometimes they didn't. If I called on a student and asked them a question, they did not know how to respond. And it was very frustrating to get to the end of 2 years of Spanish and you say, hola, ¿cómo estás? And the student just looks at you with like the eyes of a deer in the headlights. So it's very, very frustrating for me. And so that's when I decided that I needed to do a little bit more research. So I started looking at the internet, which that was probably about 2008, and the internet was, it's there, but it wasn't quite what it is today. And I came across this book here, which is about teaching proficiency through reading and storytelling. So TPRS is a term you're going to hear a lot. Now, TPRS is an actual method for teaching communicatively. But I didn't know that at the time. I just knew that what I was doing in the classroom wasn't working and I needed to try something different. So I read this book, and I actually, at the time, you couldn't even find videos on YouTube about this. So I actually ordered DVDs and I watched these DVDs about how to use this different method. And it was terrifying because this was something that was so totally different from what I was doing. It was not taking what I was already doing and adding to it. It was like a completely different thing. So I prepared, I practiced, I drove to school one day, had this I think it was like a 6-page long script of how I was going to do this storytelling with my students. And I got to school, and by recess, I talked myself out of it and quickly prepared another lesson. But a student came in just right after the bell for recess, for the end of recess rang, and he came in and he just said, "Hey, miss, can we try something different today?" And I had to laugh because I was prepared to do something different, even though I had already bagged it and I wasn't going to do it because I was chickening out. But I said, okay, you know what? We can do something different. And so I just said to my students, look, we're going to try this thing. I've never done it before, but we're going to see how it goes. And I told my first story, and it completely changed my life as far as my teaching and the students and their learning. Because for the first time at the end of that period, my students could actually retell the story that we had told in class. And my students could not speak very well at all before that. So I was super excited about that. Like I said, it was totally different. It wasn't, it wasn't this grammar-based approach. It was completely like a different fishbowl that I jumped into. And so I started to share, and I shared with my colleagues, and I wanted everybody to be able to do this because I was just sure like this was the thing to do. And I even was fortunate that Blaine Ray, who is the creator of TPRS, came to Maui, and he came and did a workshop for free. I got a bunch of teachers together and we did a one-day workshop, and it was exciting, but there were still teachers that were very hesitant. They're like, oh, maybe this works for Spanish, but I don't know if it's going to work for Japanese. And I found that I was I felt kind of like there was a pushback. And so I was uncomfortable because I knew that it worked for me, but I didn't know why it worked, and I didn't know anything about the research. So I just quietly spent the next few years in my classroom, closed the door, did what I was doing. And at times I would kind of go back to the book, and then that wouldn't work. So I'd go back to TPRS, and I just did what I was doing. And then I did that until 2016. And that's when Southwest COLT came to Oahu. That was my first regional conference that I'd ever attended. And so I went to Southwest COLT, and I left on fire because it was the first time that I'd actually could see that it wasn't just me that was doing this. There were lots of people doing this, and this wasn't just like this little isolated thing anymore that, weirdos do. It was like actually kind of a mainstream thing. So I went back home and I spent tons of money on Amazon, and I bought all of these books. And I discovered that what I was doing in the classroom for all those years was working because it actually was based on the research on how languages are acquired. And as I was going through all of these books, I realized that there was one person whose name came up a lot. And that person was Bill Van Patten. And so I found out really quickly after that he had started this podcast called Tea with BVP. And I was listening to that podcast, and I was learning more and more and more on top of what I'd already learned. And I decided that this was something that, you know, needed to be shared with the world. And so I kind of jumped on board and started to share. So that's basically my little teaching story, and how I got started with this.
Okay, well, thank you, Gina. I'm going to walk through a brief history of practices. And when we say practices, we mean things teachers do, how teachers lead classes and discussions and things like that.
Oh, sorry.
Gina, you're in control. Thank you. Cool. So there are many different ways people do things, and I've been following these for years. There are different Facebook groups, and at conferences I'll talk to people, and there are very strong opinions within CCLT, within the comprehension-based approaches, of people saying, no, a teacher must always do this thing, and other people say, nah, it's not important, but a teacher must always do this other thing. So there are disagreements within, and that's fine, because what you'll start to see is there are different goals. There are different ages of learners, different contexts in which people are learning, and that this is totally fine. I'm not going to say that one is better than the other, because I don't believe one is better than the other. But I do want to take a big step back now and go through how we got here. So in 2009 research study on pronunciation, the authors Trofimovic and other researchers give this nice little history of comprehension-based teaching, where they say over 500 years ago in the Italian Renaissance, Latin and Greek texts were taught through exposing learners to good models in these classical languages. And basically, people were reading ancient texts, and they were gaining language, recognition of how the grammar works and what words exist, how words are used in context from those texts. So that was very comprehension-based already. 1917, a more recent researcher, at least someone considered, doing research in the modern sense, he said, learners' success in mastering a foreign language appears to be in direct ratio to the degree in which they observe the natural laws of that language. And so we can understand this to mean that people seem to get better at a foreign language as they get to observe how that language is used. And so this might stand in contrast to being lectured on a list of rules, a list of, we often have grammar rules in textbooks and things like those are very normal to most language teachers. And what this guy Palmer was saying is, it seems to be that what has the biggest impact is learners being able to just see how the language is being used. According to Palmer, the most beneficial is, quote, passive work. But they say this learning experience, which we admit is not passive at all, involves large amounts of listening and reading in a second language. And I like this quote here because they're pointing out that, if you struggle through a 2-hour movie in a foreign language that you're not an expert in, you're not advanced proficiency in that language, it's taxing. It takes a lot of brain draining effort to try to pay attention and figure out what each word in each sentence and what people are talking about. So someone's body might not be moving, but that doesn't mean their brain isn't really hard at work. So yeah, not passive at all. So in 1965, in North America, we had a formal teaching approach that was based on this idea, total physical response, where James Asher said, children seem to spend a lot of time not being forced to repeat after their parents in full sentences or speak in long ways. They might babble and make sounds, but they're not being asked to develop in their language, their first language, by speaking it. They're often being told to do things. Go get the ball. Do you want this cookie? Here's the cookie. And so Asher put together a formal kind of classroom approach to emulating this, where a teacher would say, okay, you stand up and go to the door and come back and sit down and go to the door faster and come back faster. And so by using the target language, learners had a chance to see how the words were strung together and what they meant, what the meaning was by the other students acting out those actions. So it's total physical response. Oops, let's go back one more.
Sorry about that.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. And then Krashen and Terrell in 1983 had a book of just more things teachers can do that are similar to that. So, and it really introduced, this was the first introduction to teachers in North America of comprehension-based instruction. This idea that Krashen's idea was that input, so the language that learners hear and read or see signed, is necessary and it's sufficient. So that's Krashen's main idea, that you have to have input to learn a language and that's enough. And so that's what teachers started building these practices around. Okay, thank you, thank you. Bill Van Patten, we'll come back to this. Bill Van Patten has written a lot about processing instruction, and this has a lot of traction in research. A lot of researchers use this because it's very specific. You'll have different kinds of what they call structured input activities, where students hear a sentence and then have to choose A or B, or supply information, or complete a survey, or match things, or select alternatives. It's very kind of easy to set up as a research experiment to see how effective this is versus some other kind of teaching. So here's an example, an activity in that book, this 2003 book. The teacher might say, the government understands us, and the learners are learning English. And so you might have some learners that say 5, I strongly agree. Some learners that say 3, somewhat in agreement. And 1, I strongly disagree. So there's room in there for learners to express their own personal opinions about things, which can be used for follow-up discussions afterwards. But the main driving force of the learning is they are comprehending these sentences. The government helps us. The government controls us. And so that little S added after the verb is the sort of target of the teaching here. But it's through hearing it that it's taught, as opposed to, you know, long explanations and then saying, now you go home and practice it, or something else like that. So yeah, we'll mention processing instruction a little later in today's talk as well. So Blaine Ray in the 1990s, 1997, published this book, Fluency Through TPR Storytelling, which Gina mentioned having read in her own success story. It did stand for total physical response storytelling, because Blaine Ray started with just doing total physical response with his students, and then starting to turn it into stories. So get up, go to the door, go back to your seat, get up, go to the door. Does he go to the door? Okay, does he go to Mars? And so you could turn it into these little fictional kind of things. Now this information is from, if you read these different editions, they'll have the preface to the first edition, preface to the second edition, preface to the third edition, and so on. And so you can read in each one what they've changed about each edition. And so that's where I get this information. They say at one point that it used to contain 7 steps, and I don't know what those 7 steps are. I came later to TPRS. But at that time, in the beginning, the teacher would just read from a script. The teacher would write a story, and the teacher would read the story to the students, and the students would act out what the teacher was narrating. It was very formalized and scripted in the beginning. Gina, thank you. And in the preface in the 2004 edition, they point out that hundreds of teachers have been trying and reporting their new changes and successes. Emphasis was changed to reading and storytelling, and so they changed the name. They kept TPRS, but they changed it to mean teaching proficiency through reading and storytelling. And one of the big reasons for that was they stopped doing TPR as their main core of what they were doing. It was more about stories, less about doing the actual total physical response of commanding people to stand up and sit down and all that. And they changed the 7 steps down to 3 steps. So the teacher would introduce the main vocabulary for the story. The teacher would ask a story, which means negotiate what happens in each part of the story with the students. And then they would read text together. So what's really, I think, interesting about this is that even though Blaine Ray's name is always on the books, Blaine Ray and Conti Seeley, the current way of doing TPRS is the result of many changes from hundreds of teachers reporting what did and did not work with their students and new things that they were trying. And then this big collective of teachers trying and feeding it back. It's this big sort of communal teaching approach that is now developed, or a method, because it's so structured. But yeah, and it still continues to change.
Yeah, just a little side note that I was reminded when you were talking about Blaine Ray and the book. remember that I actually used that book to learn how to do TPRS. And I remember telling him my story, and he was like, wow, it's so exciting to actually hear a teacher that used the book and learn how to do the actual method, because, they were doing workshops and things, but not in Maui, so
Yeah.
it was funny when he said that.
Well, a lot of teachers will also say with TPRS, especially they read the book and it's got so many little details in it, which again are from hundreds of teachers reporting, here's this little thing that worked for me, here's this little thing that worked for me. And they all get sort of codified into this book. But a lot of teachers will say, yeah, I've read the book and I'm not sure how this is supposed to actually look in my classroom. So people need to see those demos and experience it as a learner to get what it means. And then TPRS is other books have been written. So it's been kind of adapted for Chinese because Chinese has special reading considerations that do add challenges. And a lot of teachers want to know, how do I adapt this for Chinese, Japanese? Will, I think, has done some great things with that in his Japanese classrooms. Yeah, okay. And then there are other things. So story listening is another kind of radically different one. There's no collaboration between the teachers and students. What the teacher wants is more kind of what they call rich input, which is more grammatically complicated language and more variety of words being used. And so the teacher will choose a story from the target culture. If you're teaching Japanese language, then you would choose Japanese stories. If you're teaching German, you'd teach actual German stories. And the teacher, for beginning learners, would simplify their language quite a bit, but the teacher just tells stories while drawing, and students just sit and watch. So that's another it's another kind of opposite kind. And TPRS is all about collaborating with students and building stories together. And story listening is really about students just trying their best to comprehend a story as the teacher tells it. And there's other offshoots. An offshoot of TPRS specifically was teachers who didn't want to target as much. Like the teacher chooses vocab and repeats that vocab a lot in the story. And so instead you just build something with students and you let the repetition kind of happen more gradually over time. And so that's non-targeted comprehensible input. And here's one book that is the people who started that. And automatic language growth is an interesting one. It's, as far as I know, it mainly only exists in Thailand. And it's, I would say, even more rich than story listening. It's teachers of Thai language giving lectures about Thai culture, Thai history, Thai food, Thai society. And students are expected to commit at least 100 hours, several hundred hours at least, of just sitting and listening. And so the teacher tries to not shelter anything. The teacher just speaks fluently in Thai, and the students just have to be really patient. And people who like it love it. I don't have any complaints about it. I just think there's different goals for different people.
All right. Thank you very much, Reed. I'm now going to share just actually, if you'll bear with me, two stories, one personal, I feel, and one professional, about how CLT has changed my teaching and a lot of what I'm doing. So if you could, go ahead, Gina. First off is a personal story. I had already been introduced to CLT. I knew it was where I wanted to go. And I wanted to also help share it with teachers. And so I arranged actually for Gina, who had done all that hard work before, to come to one of the Hawaiian Association of Teachers of Japanese workshops and give a presentation about about CLT to Japanese teachers on Oahu. And so we made the arrangements, and it was the day of the presentation, and last minute my wife got called into work. And so I had to bring my daughter with me, and it's not a big deal. She's come before. She was 9 at the time. She is bilingual. She speaks Japanese and English, but she had never heard Spanish before. And so after Gina gave a little background about CLT, she went in and started talking about, she created one of these stories that we're talking. She asked a story, all in Spanish. And we had my daughter also contribute. And like I said, she didn't know any Spanish. Her Spanish was limited to Dora the Explorer, and that was it. But at the end of just a short half an hour, 40-minute just real quick, the basics of asking a story. My daughter completely understood the story of an elephant that went to France and went to the Eiffel Tower. She could answer questions. She could even tell some of the story back. And like I said, I had been already on board with CLT, but just having my daughter in that such a short time gained so much. It was just amazing to me. And that just cemented my belief that, hey, this is definitely something that I am into. I really want to do this. So that's my personal story. Professional story, you know, I work at Waipahu High School, and we have an amazing, I call it, if you look at the site, it's the dream team at Waipahu, with supporting each other. Some of the teachers took Gina's PDE3 CLT course, and they raved about it. And then most of the rest of the department also took it, and we loved it. There are a few people that didn't. We knew this is what we wanted to do, and we were able to actually bring Gina to our school to give a one-day workshop. And we did a couple things there that really made this key. We invited all the language teachers, of course, to come in, especially the ones who hadn't been experienced to it. But we also invited one of our assistant principals to come in. And I think she couldn't even stay the entire day. But after that workshop, our assistant principal was more excited about this than many of the language teachers were. And that was just huge. So it was really good for us, because as a department, we decided this was the direction we wanted to go to. And as a department, we could then focus on different strategies. We could work with each other. We could observe each other's classes, and really design curriculum together based off of this. And that has made such a huge difference at our school. But the other, like I mentioned, having the admin support behind it was really, really, I can't tell you how important it was. So if after this conference, this is something that you feel you really want to bring back, I really recommend try it yourself. Invite people to come watch your classroom. Let them see what's happening, because that's going to be more powerful than you trying to tell them. Invite your admin. Get the support of the department head, the admin. Watch them, have them come in and see what's happening in the classroom and see how it's effective. And if you can, join some of the different groups. There's Tulip, there's come to all the different presentations that we have, and be a learner. Be in the seat of somebody learning a new language for the first time, and you'll see how effective it really is. I have on the slide, you know, you can't go back, but even if you could, would you want to? You know, my whole little matrix quote right there, if you guys all remember that. But it's really true. I don't know if anybody else here can think of somebody who, you know, put a little time and really tried some of these CLT techniques, and then said, yeah, no, I think I'm going to go back to teaching particles and verb conjugation. Yeah, I haven't met that person. Maybe they exist, but everybody that I've met that we've introduced this to, and they've looked into and tried even just a little bit, they quickly realized the power behind these techniques. And I highly encourage you to try it too.
Awesome. Thanks, Will. Yeah, I think that that's a really good idea. You know, invite your admin, and also, you know, for me, a big part of it was understanding the research part. I mean, not understanding everything, but just understanding that the research supports it. I think it's super important. All right, so that brings us to popularity today. So as I mentioned, when I went to that conference in 2016 here in Hawaii, I noticed that this is not something that was just a little small fringe thing that was happening on the side anymore. It had grown significantly. And today it's just, I mean, amazing how much this is multiplied. And this is, you know, not just nationwide, but worldwide. You're seeing that this is something that is, you know, being embraced because it actually works. So I see it at conferences. I see that the presentations that are being submitted and accepted, a lot of them have the word CI next to them, or or have CCLT or CLT. Different organizations. I'm part of the regional Southwest HALT and also part of HALT, as well as ACTFL, and I see it in all of those places that this is something that is just accepted and embraced. On social media, I went to Facebook a couple days ago just to see what would come up, and I just put in comprehensible input, and 26 groups popped up right away that you can join. Two of the bigger groups, IFLT, there are 11.5 thousand members, and TPRS Deskless Classroom had 4.5 thousand members. And a few years ago, this was like in the hundreds. So it's completely just exploded. Webinars, there are, you hear about webinars. I think it's Teachers Discovery is doing a lot of free webinars. Many of those webinars are comprehension-based or communicative language teaching webinars. Podcasts, I don't even know how many there are. I've heard probably at least 5 or 6 in the last couple of years that I've listened to that are focused on CCLT. If you just go to Google and type in comprehensible input, pages of websites and blogs pop up. Go to YouTube, same thing. You'll have tons of stuff pop up. On YouTube, some of it's really good, some of it maybe not so good, but there's stuff out there. And then finally, it's gotten so much easier to find resources. When I first started, the only resources I could find basically were the things from TPRS books from Blaine Ray. Now you go to Teachers Discovery and you flip through their magazine pages, or you look online and there's just CI everywhere. Teachers Pay Teachers, tons of teachers are posting different lesson plans or activities or games and different things that are related to comprehension-based language teaching. Also, you can find so many novels. I know that it's still not in every language, but it's growing, and you can find some novels in even in Japanese and in Chinese as well. But the library for Spanish novels is just, I can't even read all the books. There's so many of them now. And when I started, I think there were like 7. So anyway, so it's really become very popular and not so much of a fringe thing. So our national organization, ACTFL, has a special interest group it's called Comprehension-based Communicative Language Teaching. And it is the second largest special interest group in ACTFL. The only other larger one is language educators, which I don't know, Reed, I think that might actually be everybody who's part of the of ACTFL is in that group automatically. So if that's true, then the most popular one is the comprehension-based, or the CCLT group. So anyway, that's just a little bit about the popularity nationwide. And then here in Hawaii, we have had our HALT Summer Summit. This is actually the 4th year that we've had a Summer Summit, but the 3rd year that we've had it, where it's a CCLT Summer Summit. And then, as you know, at the spring conference, we just had Bill Van Patten was our keynote speaker. So it's bleeding into everything. And then finally, I think we started it in 2018, the Tulip Gatherings. Is that right? Yeah. So in 2018, we started a group. TULIP stands for Teaching and Understanding Languages in Paradise. And this initially started as a group of people that would physically get together on Oahu and share strategies and practice strategies and coach each other and do demonstrations. And now with COVID-19, it's turned into a Zoom gathering. And I think it's grown a little bit. And also it's grown wide in the sense that we have neighbor island people coming in to practice teaching and discuss and get feedback from each other. So very, very popular, and it's very exciting to see it growing.
All right, thanks, Gina. My name is Evelyn Coffey, and I'm going to just share my teaching stories as it relates to the university setting. So back in 2015, I had just finished my master's in French from the University of Hawaii. I had been teaching as a graduate assistant teacher for 2 years, and had when I had graduated, I got rehired as a lecturer in the French department. So I was feeling confident. You know, I've done this for 2 years. I got this. My lesson plans are cookie cutter. They, you know, day 1 through, I don't know how many days are in a semester. I don't know, week 1 to week 17. They're planned. I got this. I can do this. So I started off teaching, and everything was basically as it had been when I was a grad assistant teacher. But now that I had a little bit more time, I wasn't, you know, studying on the side, but I had more time, I could focus on really what the outcomes were of my students. I started to notice that they weren't getting better in the way that I thought they were. I had high expectations, and they were frequently falling short. And so by 2017, and what I mean by falling short is that, as Gina explained with her students, you ask them a question and they're supposed to have had 3 semesters of this, you know, this is their 4th semester of French. I walk in day 1 and say, bonjour, comment allez-vous? Comment vous appelez-vous? And they look at me like, and how is that possible? These were my students even. And how could they not tell me, hello, my name is, how are you? Response, like what was going on? So in 2017, I was starting to feel terrible, basically, about what I was seeing in my classes. And I really thought that it was me. I thought that I was not a good teacher, that I just wasn't able to get my students to a place where they could communicate. And it was all because I just was a bad teacher. And I was frankly ready to call it quits and try something new in the sense of a new profession and give up teaching altogether, even though I had fallen in love with teaching. And I just was sort of at wit's end until I went to my first HALT conference. And that was in 2018, in the spring of 2018. And at that conference, there were a number of presentations, but the theme in general was all about CCLT. And Gina presented that during that conference, and her presentation really struck me, and what she was sharing, even just the simple definition of communication and what that is and what we're trying to do in our class, and how our modern, so-called modern methods of, you know, grammar-based instruction weren't falling in line with our goal of communication. And so I took that to heart, and the conference theme, I think, was try one thing. And so I started looking into what could that one thing be. I started going back and researching all these terms and words and ideas that had come up. The internet was a little bit farther along in 2018 than Gina had in 2007. So I started attending more HALT conferences. They had the summer summit. I attended. Then that fall, there was a fall conference, a fall symposium that had more presentations on more CCLT. Even that August, I flew to Canada for a conference for another teaching method. That December, I attended a 4-day session with Tina Hargadin that came out to do, and Justin Slocum-Bailey, who also presented during those 4 days. And I was just trying to soak up everything I possibly could to figure out how to do this in my college classes. Because the problem is that while I was tasked in my head, I had given myself the task of try one thing, I had also been given a curriculum, and I had been given themes in a textbook that I had to present, and grammar points that my students had to be tested on. And I could not figure out what that one thing could be that I could reach both the curriculum targets and my own communication targets for my students. So I came up with storytelling, just sort of a generic mesh of various methods of teaching, CCLT methods that I thought might work. And I say storytelling because it's sort of broad and encompassing many different elements like TPRS, movie talk, picture talk, card talk. I just started trying one every week, just started seeing what would work, what could possibly be molded to fit my curriculum. And stories actually seemed to work really well. And these weren't necessarily stories that I co-created with my students. A lot of the times they were scripted stories that I forced the vocabulary from our chapter into, which if anyone uses curriculum that gives you like, we're going to study IR verbs, and here's a list of all IR verbs that we're going to learn, they don't always have anything in common. So these stories came out really weird sometimes, which was fun and interesting, and students laughed and they were participating. And I thought, yeah, this is working. But at the end of the semester, they were still not really speaking. They weren't really communicating. It was still just me forcing these methods onto my grammar-based curriculum, and the results were interesting, but not as expected. So fast forward to this spring, and COVID-19 has hit, and we are all forced online. And the first day of class, online, I'm there. I have all 19 of my students on Zoom, and I decide we're gonna just finish the chapter that we had almost finished right before COVID forced us online. And so I pull up my lecture as I would have done in class, and I go for it, and I do my best to try and hit these grammar points and explain using a story, you know, a funny, weird story, what this grammar thing is here, and, you know, let's practice this here, let's put you into breakout rooms, and now you guys are going to talk, and you're going to read this line, and he's going to respond using this line. And it was still just really just forcing it. And instantly I realized this is not going to work. This platform is not going to facilitate what I was doing before, much less this weird mesh that I'm trying to make. And so in talking with Gina, actually, I talked myself into finally jumping in with both feet and using TPRS exclusively in my class. And this is March. And I share with my students, I say, listen, we're going to do something completely new for the rest of the semester. And because this semester is completely new, no one has ever done this type of switch mid-semester where we have to go online and do all these things. So bear with me. It's going to be new. It's going to be fun, I guarantee you, but it's going to be different. So keep your expectations basically off and just join me on this journey as we figure this out together. I presented with a little more confidence than that, I think, to my students. But I started doing TPRS, and we had 10 hours of class before the end of the semester where we were just doing exclusively TPRS. 10 hours, that's it. At the end of this semester, these are 101 students. This means this is their first semester of French. I was having 15-minute conversations, full question and answer, completely organic in the sense of I didn't give them a list of questions they had to know. I didn't give them a dialogue they had to know. I just said, we're going to talk for 15 minutes, and that's going to be your final oral exam. These kids did it. They actually were communicating with me. They were telling me all about their family, where they lived, the things they liked to do, what they didn't like, what things were hard for them, how much fun it was to be in my class in French. There was no English whatsoever during these final oral exams. And I have never experienced that in any of my classes since I've been teaching for the last 6-7 years. So for me, that's what did it. I mean, TPRS had proven the results to me right there with my students. And as Will said, how can you ever go back when you've seen the results that you get when you teach with various CCLT methods? And so going forward, if I have the pleasure of teaching again at UH, then I am seriously considering how I can present this kind of present French this way with my students, and hopefully have meaningful conversations with them in French for years to come based on what we come up with in class using TPRS and other methods.
Thanks, Evelyn.
Thank you, Evelyn. Yeah, that was a great story. So let's talk a little bit. Teachers and administrators and people in general, when we talk about these things and we share our stories, they'll often say, "Hey, has any research been done on this?" It comes up pretty regularly. So let's get into that. All right. So this 2009 research study, also in their history of the methods, they say that in modern times, there are 4 strands of research that support comprehension-based instruction. That there's a silent period often with children and also older learners who don't speak for a while and are not pressured to repeat sentences after somebody or fill in the blanks or anything like that. And when they do start to speak, it's suddenly in full sentences. They're just ready for it. So it shows that something is going on in their head, that they're processing language even when they're not moving their mouth, or maybe they are moving their mouth and you don't see it. But the point is that there is a silent period. It's a normally observed thing. And so that shows that, yeah, the brain is doing stuff. Performance on tasks is how people measure things. So they'll say, you know, here's a series of pictures. Can you describe them in the target language? And they'll see some people just get input. You know, they listen and read. Other people get a mix of input and speaking practice and other things. And then they'll compare how they do on the same tasks. Immersion and content-based instruction is where immersion often with children, but also older as well. I know Canadian immersion programs are rather famous. So students will take all of their history classes and math classes and other content classes, and the teacher is just lecturing in French. And students aren't repeating after the teacher constantly. They're just listening for the meaning and then taking notes and getting ready for tests and school stuff like that. And also results after delayed speech production. I'm not going to get into details in this, so we're gonna skip on ahead. Okay, so this study that I've referred to a couple of times, the 2009 paper, it was Canadian children were listening to ESL audio, English as a second language audio, while reading along. They were given access to a library. During the first weeks, they were restricted. They said you can only put on headphones and listen to these few books. These are for the total beginners. And then once this time is done, then you can go on to choose any books you want anytime. And you have to listen for 30 minutes a day, 5 days a week. And it was 90 hours for the whole year. The teachers in this study were French speakers, and they were not comfortable practicing or speaking English with the kids. And so they were relieved. They reported being relieved that the kids could just put on headphones and read English books and just listen to English. And they were not asked to speak with their peers. They were not asked to speak with their teachers. There was no speaking of any kind. There were other groups of students in other classrooms that did traditional instruction. There was lots of speaking practice. And remember that in any kind of instruction, there's always input. In any kind of instruction, it doesn't matter if the teacher's saying, repeat after me, or notice the sentence, here's the grammar. You're always having some exposure to example sentences. But what they found at the end of this, after the end of 1 year, was that there was no difference in pronunciation in terms of what they measured called accentedness, comprehensibility, and fluency. So how do we interpret this? Is that saying, well, if it doesn't matter, then I should just teach however I want and who cares? That's not the takeaway that I want to emphasize from this study. And I offer a little metaphor that I think helps me think about it, is that if you had people that said, plants only need sunlight and water, and plant food offers very little extra. And so I don't bother with much a little plant food maybe, but I mostly just put my plants in the sun and I water them several days a week. And then other groups of people who say, no, science has shown that plant food does have a positive effect. Therefore, I give my plants a diet of 1/3 plant food, 2 hours a day of sunlight, and like 1 cup of water every week. And so, or let's say there's a third group that got all the daily sunlight, daily water, same as the first group, but they also got plant food. And what we end up seeing is that the group that just gave their plants sunlight and water had the same healthy plants as the group that gave the plants sunlight, water, plus plant food. So then the takeaway would be, well, then what did the plant food do? Did it do much at all? And so what we're showing from this study, at least in terms of pronunciation, and at least for the first year, is that this extra speaking practice and this extra grammar stuff didn't seem to add anything, but the input was was fine. It already did the work it needed to do. After the years beyond that second year, third year, the groups that did have extra speaking practice and did have that extra grammar did start to show some signs of doing better than the other groups. And so there's something to be said for later on, not during the first year, but maybe later on, that some kinds of instruction maybe can be helpful. And then a similar one, a grammar learning study focused on 35 published research experiments between 1991 and 2010. People were comparing input only versus input plus other things, speaking practice and grammar and such. Second language was Spanish, English, Japanese, French, so different kinds of target languages. I'm oversimplifying when I say this, and so I recommend people do find this article. It's more complicated, but it simply stated there were similar results for the first year, that the speaking practice didn't do much, and that processing instruction, what we said, Bill Van Patten's system of repeatedly asking questions in the target language and students fill out little forms and stuff, contributed the most to the differences between the two groups. And so there's something about that repetitive input gives learners an opportunity, my interpretation at least, is that learners have an opportunity to start to see how the language is structured, see how words are used, how grammar kind of works. So yeah, so grammar also, at least for the first year, seems to be fine. Plenty of research has been done on TPRS. These are often teachers researching their own students in their classrooms. And so in 2015, there were 14 published articles and 21 theses, and many showed, the majority showed TPRS had an advantage. Some studies showed they were equal, and some studies showed mixed results, and no studies had shown that there was a disadvantage to using TPRS. And in terms of expected outcomes, so what TPRS had the advantage was in vocabulary and speaking and reading. Grammar and motivation were also, they also did pretty well. And then for some reason, listening and writing have these kind of mixed results. And so one reason I can think is that if you're only getting slow input, you're only listening to a teacher speak slowly for you, then when you give an assessment where you're listening to native speakers speaking at natural speed, maybe you're not ready for that. So that's something that could be thought about in our classrooms. But we'd have to look more at why TPRS had somewhat of a mixed results for listening and writing outcomes. Okay, so there are just many different ways of doing it. And so we're going to see presenters throughout the week talk about different ways that they do this in their own classrooms.
All right. Well, I think that brings us to the end of our presentation. So hopefully you learned a little bit about, or have I guess maybe some broader knowledge about what comprehension-based communicative language teaching is, what some of the methods are, what some of the strategies are, and throughout the conference, this 2020 Summer Summit, you're going to be meeting some teachers nationally who have been using different strategies, and they're going to share those strategies with you. If you have any questions, feel free to contact any of us. We have our emails listed here on this slide. And anything else, anyone? Is that it?
Thank you very much.
All right. Yes, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys.
Okay.